The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 2, Side 1. He is worst remembered by his quarrel with the Roman humanists. Some of these were secretaries to the Pope or the cardinals. Most of them filled less dignified positions as abbreviatores, writers of briefs or keepers of records for the Curia. Whether as a measure of economy, or to rid the Collegium Abbreviatorum of the 58 Sienese whom Pius II had appointed to it, Paul disbanded the whole group, gave its work to other departments, and left some 70 humanists jobless or reduced to less lucrative posts. The most eloquent of these dismissed humanists was Bartolomeo de Sacchi, who took the Latin name Platina from his native Piadena, near Cremona. He appealed to the Pope to re-employ the dismissed men. When Paul refused, he wrote him a threatening letter. Paul had him arrested and kept him for 4 months in Sant'Angelo, bound with heavy chains. Cardinal Gonzaga secured his release, but Platina, Paul thought, would bear watching. The leader of the humanists in Rome was Giulio Pomponio Leto, allegedly the natural son of Prince Sanseverino of Salerno. Coming to Rome in youth, he attached himself to Valla as a disciple and succeeded him as professor of Latin in the university. He became so enamored of pagan literature that he lived and had his being not in the Rome of Nicholas V or Paul II, but in that of the Catos or the Caesars. He was the first to edit the agricultural classics of Varro and Columella, and he sedulously followed their precepts in tending his vineyard. He remained content in learned poverty, spent half his time among the historic ruins, wept at their spoliation and desolation, Latinized his name to Pomponius Letus, and walked to his classroom in ancient Roman dress. Hardly any hall could hold the crowd that gathered at dawn to hear his lectures. Some students came at midnight to secure a place. He despised the Christian religion, denounced its preachers as hypocrites, and trained his scholars in the Stoic rather than the Christian morality. His home was a museum of Roman antiquities, a meeting place for students and teachers of Roman lore. About 1460 he organized them into a Roman academy, whose members took pagan names, gave such names to their children in baptism, exchanged the Christian faith for a religious worship of the Genius of Rome, performed Latin comedies, and celebrated the anniversary of Rome's foundation with pagan ceremonies in which the officiating members were termed sacerdotes, and Letus was called Pontifex Maximus. Some enthusiastic members dreamed of restoring the Roman Republic. Early in 1468, a citizen laid before the papal police a charge that the Academy was plotting to depose and arrest the Pope. Certain cardinals supported the charge and assured the pontiff that a rumor in Rome was predicting his early death. Paul ordered the arrest of Letus, Platina, and other leaders of the Academy. Pomponius wrote humble apologies and professions of orthodoxy. After due chastening, he was released and resumed his lecturing, but with such careful conformity that when he died in 1498, 40 bishops attended his funeral. Platina was tortured to elicit evidence of a conspiracy. No such evidence was anywhere found, but Platina, despite a dozen letters of apology, was kept in prison for a year. Paul decreed the dissolution of the Academy as a nest of heresy and forbade the teaching of pagan literature in the schools of Rome. His successor allowed the Academy to reopen reformed and gave the penitent Platina charge of the Vatican Library. There, Platina found the materials for his graphic and elegant biographies of the popes, In Vitas Summorum Pontificum. And when he came to Paul II, he took his revenge. His indictment might with more justice have been reserved for Sixtus IV. 6. Sixtus IV, 1471 to 1484. Of the 18 cardinals who met to choose a new pontiff, 15 were Italian, Rodrigo Borgia was Spanish, de Toutteville was French, Bessarion was Greek. One participant later described the election of Cardinal Francesco della Rovere as due to intrigue and bribery, ex artibus et corruptilis. But this seems to have meant only that various offices were promised to various cardinals for their votes. The new pope illustrated the admirable equality of opportunity, among Italians, to reach the papacy. He was born of a peasant family at Pecorile, near Savona. Repeatedly ill as a child, he was consecrated to St. Francis by his mother in prayer for his recovery. At 9 he was sent to a Franciscan convent, and later entered the Minorite order. For a while he served as tutor in the della Rovere family, whose name he took as his own. He studied philosophy and theology at Pavia, Bologna, and Padua, and taught them there and elsewhere to classes so crowded that almost every learned Italian of the next generation was said to have been his pupil. When at 57 he became Sixtus IV, his reputation was that of a scholar distinguished for learning and integrity. Almost overnight, by one of the strangest transformations in papal history, he became a politician and a warrior. Finding Europe too divided and its governments too corrupt for a crusade against the Turks, he decided to confine his secular efforts to Italy. There, too, of course, he found division. In the Papal States, the authority of the Pope largely flouted by local rulers. In Latium, a rule by noble violence ignoring the papal power. And in Rome, a mob so disorderly that at his coronation it stoned his litter in anger at a crush caused by a stoppage of the cavalcade. Sixtus proposed to restore order in Rome, to reinvigorate legatine authority in the Papal States, and to bring Italy under the unifying rule of the Pope. Surrounded by chaos, distrustful of strangers, and subject to family affection, Sixtus appointed his avid nephews to positions of power and revenue. It was the prime curse of his pontificate that those whom he loved best proved worst, and took such venal advantage of their place that all Italy came to despise them. The favorite nephew was Pietro, or Piero, Riario, a youth of some charm, cheerful, witty, courteous, generous, but so fond of luxury and sensual delights that even the rich benefices bestowed upon him by the Pope failed to finance the tastes of this formerly mendicant friar. Sixtus made him a cardinal at 25 in 1471, and gave him the bishoprics of Treviso, Senegalia, Spalato, Florence, and other dignities, with a total income of 60,000 ducats, or $1.5 million a year. Pietro spent all and more on vessels of silver and gold, fine raiment, tapestries, embroideries, a pretentious retinue, expensive public games, and the patronage of painters, poets, and scholars. The festivities, including a banquet that lasted 6 hours, with which he and his cousin Giuliano welcomed to Rome Ferrante's daughter Eleonora, marked a height of extravagance hardly equaled there since Lucullus or Nero. Dizzy with power, Pietro made a triumphal tour of Florence, Bologna, Ferrara, Venice, and Milan, enjoying regal honors everywhere as a prince of the blood, displaying his mistresses in costly attire, and making plans to become pope on or before the death of his uncle. But on his return to Rome, he died in 1474 of his excesses at the age of 28, having spent 200,000 ducats in 2 years and owing 60,000 more. His brother Girolamo was made commander of the papal armies and lord of Imola and Forli. We have already disposed of him there. Another nephew, Leonardo della Rovere, was made prefect of Rome, and when he died his brother Giovanni succeeded him. The ablest of these innumerable nephews was Giuliano della Rovere, who will require a chapter as Julius II. His life was reasonably decent, and he rose to the papacy over every obstacle by force of intellect and character. The plans of Sixtus to strengthen the Papal States disturbed the other governments of Italy. Lorenzo de' Medici, as we have before related, schemed to get Imola for Florence. Sixtus outplayed him, and replaced the Medici with the Pazzi as bankers for the papacy. Lorenzo tried to ruin the Pazzi, they tried to kill him. Sixtus agreed to the conspiracy, but deprecated murder. "Go and do what you will," he told the plotters, "provided there be no killing." The result was a war that lasted from 1478 to 1480, until the Turks threatened to overrun Italy. When that danger subsided, Sixtus was free to resume his liberation of the Papal States. Late in 1480, the Ordelaffi line of dictators died out at Forli, and the people asked the Pope to take over the city. Sixtus bade Girolamo govern Imola and Forli together. Girolamo suggested taking Ferrara next, and persuaded Sixtus and Venice to join in war upon Duke Ercole in 1482. Ferrante of Naples sent troops to defend his son-in-law. Florence and Milan also helped Ferrara, and the Pope, who had begun his reign with plans for European peace, found that he had plunged all Italy into war. Harassed by Naples on the south, by Florence in the north, and by disturbances in Rome, Sixtus came to terms with Ferrara after a year of chaos and bloodshed. When the Venetians refused to follow suit, he excommunicated them and joined Florence and Milan in war upon his late ally. The nobles of the capital had felt justified, by the example of a warlike pontiff, in renewing their exhilarating feuds. It was one of the polite customs of Rome to plunder the palace of a cardinal just elected to the papacy. In so handling the palace of one of the Della Rovere cardinals, a young aristocrat, Francesco di Santa Croce, had been wounded by a member of the Della Valle family. The youth revenged himself by cutting the tendon of Della Valle's heel. Della Valle's relatives avenged him by cleaving Francesco's head. Prospero di Santa Croce revenged Francesco by killing Piero Margani. The feud spread through the city, the Orsini and the papal forces supporting the Santa Croce, the Colonna defending the Valle. Lorenzo Odone Colonna was captured, tried, tortured into a confession, and put to death in Sant'Angelo, though his brother Fabrizio surrendered 2 Colonna fortresses to Sixtus in the hope of having Lorenzo spared. Prospero Colonna joined Naples in war on the Pope, ravaged the Campagna, raided Rome. Sixtus engaged Roberto Malatesta of Rimini to come and lead the papal troops. Roberto defeated the Neapolitan and Colonna forces at Campomorto, returned to Rome victorious, and died of fever contracted in the Campagna swamps. Girolamo Riario took his place, and Sixtus officially blessed the artillery that his nephew directed against the Colonna citadels. But while the Pope's spirit willed war, his body collapsed under the strain of successive crises. In June 1484, he too came down with fever. On August 11th, news came to him that his allies had made peace with Venice over his protests. He refused to ratify it. The next day he died. Sixtus was in many ways a preview of Julius II, as Girolamo Riario rehearsed the career of Caesar Borgia. A stern imperial priest who loved war and art and power, Sixtus pursued his purposes without scruple or finesse, but with wild energy and unhesitating courage to the end. Like later warrior popes, he made enemies who tried to weaken his arms by blackening his name. Some gossips accounted for his lavish support of Pietro and Girolamo Riario by calling them his sons. Others, like Infessura, called them his lovers, and did not hesitate to term the Pope a sodomite. The picture is bad enough without these incredible and unsupported allegations. After exhausting on his nephews the treasury that Paul II had left full, Sixtus financed his wars by selling ecclesiastical offices to the highest bidder. A hostile Venetian ambassador quotes him as saying that a pope needs only pen and ink to get whatever sum he wishes. But this is equally true of most modern governments, whose interest-bearing bonds correspond in many ways with the salary-bearing sinecures sold by the popes. Sixtus, however, was not content with this scheme. He kept throughout the papal states a monopoly on the sale of corn. He sold the best abroad and the rest to his people at a goodly profit. He had learned this trick from the other rulers of his time, like Ferrante of Naples. Presumably he charged no more than private engrossers would have done, since it is an unwritten law of economics that the price of a product depends on the gullibility of the purchaser. But the poor grumbled forgivably at the thought that their hunger fed the luxuries of the Riarios. Despite these and other devices for raising revenues, Sixtus left debts totaling 150,000 ducats, or $3.75 million. A substantial portion of his revenues was spent on art and public works. He tried, unsuccessfully, to drain the pestilential marshes around Foligno, and at last dreamt of draining the Pontine swamps. He had the major streets of Rome straightened, widened, and paved. He improved the water supply, restored bridges, walls, gates, and towers, spanned the Tiber with the Ponte Sisto that bears his name, built a new Vatican library and the Sistine Chapel above it, founded the Sistine Choir, and rebuilt the ruined Hospital of Santo Spirito, whose main ward, 365 feet long, could accommodate 1,000 patients. He reorganized the University of Rome and opened to the public the Capitoline Museum that Paul II had established. This was the first public museum in Europe. During his pontificate, and largely under the direction of Baccio Pontelli, the churches of Santa Maria della Pace and Santa Maria del Popolo were erected, and many others were repaired. In Santa Maria del Popolo, Mino da Fiesole and Andrea Bregno sculptured a noble tomb for Cardinal Cristoforo della Rovere, circa 1477. And in Santa Maria in Aracoeli, Pinturicchio pictured the career of San Bernardino of Siena in some of the finest frescoes in Rome, circa 1484. The Sistine Chapel was designed by Giovannino de' Dolci, simply and unpretentiously, for semi-private worship by the popes and high ecclesiastics. It was beautified with a marble sanctuary screened by Mino da Fiesole, and by spacious frescoes recounting on the south wall scenes from the life of Moses, and on the north wall corresponding scenes from the life of Christ. For these paintings, Sixtus called to Rome the greatest masters of the time: Perugino, Signorelli, Pinturicchio, Domenico and Benedetto Ghirlandaio, Botticelli, Cosimo Rosselli, and Piero di Cosimo. Sixtus offered an additional reward for the best picture of the 15 painted there by these men. Rosselli, knowing his own inferiority in design, decided to stake all on brilliant coloring. His fellow artists laughed at his lavish spread of ultramarine and gold, but Sixtus gave him the prize. The warrior pope brought other painters to Rome and organized them into a protective guild under the aegis of St. Luke. It was for Sixtus that Melozzo da Forli did his best work. Coming to Rome about 1472, after studying with Piero della Francesca, he painted in the church of Santi Apostoli a fresco of the Ascension, which aroused the enthusiasm of Vasari. All but a few fragments of it disappeared when the church was rebuilt, around 1702 and following. Gracious and tender are the Angel and the Virgin of the Annunciation in the Uffizi Gallery, but finer still the Angeli Musicanti, one with a viol, one with a lute, in the Vatican. Melozzo's masterpiece was painted as a fresco in the Vatican Library and was later transferred to canvas. Against the ornate pillars and ceiling of the library, 6 figures are portrayed with veracity and power. Sixtus, seated, massive and regal. At his right, the gay Pietro Riario. Standing before him, the tall dark Giuliano della Rovere. Kneeling before him, the high-browed Platina, receiving appointment as librarian. And behind him, Giovanni della Rovere and Count Girolamo Riario. It is a living picture of an eventful pontificate. In 1475, the Vatican Library contained 2,527 volumes in Latin and Greek. Sixtus added 1,100 more, and for the first time threw the collection open to the public. He restored the humanists to favor, though he paid them with preoccupied irregularity. He called Filelfo to Rome, and that warrior of the pen praised the Pope enthusiastically until his annual salary of 600 florins, or $15,000, fell into arrears. Joannes Argyropoulos was invited from Florence to Rome, where his lectures on the Greek language and literature were attended by cardinals, bishops, and foreign students like Reuchlin. Sixtus also brought to Rome the German scientist Johann Müller, Regiomontanus, and commissioned him to correct the Julian calendar. But Müller died a year later in 1476, and calendar reform had to wait a century more, until 1582. It is remarkable that a Franciscan friar and professor of philosophy and theology should have become the first secularizing pope of the Renaissance, or more precisely, the first Renaissance pope whose chief interest was to establish the papacy as a strong political power in Italy. Perhaps excepting the case of Ferrara, whose able rulers had faithfully paid their feudal dues, Sixtus was perfectly justified in seeking to make the papal states papal, and to make Rome and its environs safe for the popes. History might forgive, as it has forgiven Julius II, his use of war for these ends. It might acknowledge that his diplomacy merely followed the amoral principles of other states. But it finds no pleasure in watching a pope conspire with assassins, bless cannon, or wage war with a thoroughness that shocked his time. The death of 1,000 men at Campo Morto was a heavier loss of life than any battle yet fought in Renaissance Italy. The morality of the Roman court was further lowered by reckless nepotism and unblushing simony, and the costly indecent revels of his kin. In these and other ways, Sixtus IV made straight the way for Alexander VI, and contributed, as he responded, to the moral disintegration of Italy. It was Sixtus who appointed Torquemada to head the Spanish Inquisition. Sixtus, who, provoked by the virulence and license of Roman satire, gave the inquisitors in Rome power to prohibit the printing of any book they did not like. At his death he might have admitted many failures, against Lorenzo, Naples, Ferrara, Venice, and even the Colonna were not yet subdued. 3 significant successes he had achieved. He had made Rome a fairer and healthier city. He had given it invigorating draughts of fresh air, and he had restored the papacy to its place among the most powerful monarchies in Europe. 7. Innocent VIII, 1484 to 1492. The failure of Sixtus was confirmed by the chaos that ruled Rome after his death. Mobs sacked the papal granaries, broke into the banks of the Genoese, attacked the palace of Girolamo Riario. Vatican attendants stripped the Vatican of its furniture. The noble factions armed themselves, barricades were thrown up in the streets, Girolamo was forced to quit his campaign against the Colonna and lead his troops back to the city. The Colonna recaptured many of their citadels. A conclave was hastily assembled in the Vatican, and an exchange of promises and bribes between Cardinal Borgia and Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere secured the election of Giovanni Battista Cibo of Genoa, who took the name of Innocent VIII. He was 52, tall and handsome, kindly and peaceable to the point of complacent weakness, of moderate intelligence and experience. A contemporary described him as not wholly ignorant. He had at least one son and one daughter, probably more. He acknowledged them candidly, and after taking priestly orders he led an apparently celibate life. Though the Roman wits wrote epigrams about his children, few Romans held it against the Pope that he had been so fertile in his youth. But they raised eyebrows when he declared the marriages of his children and grandchildren in the Vatican. In truth, Innocent was content to be a grandfather, to enjoy domestic affection and ease. He gave Politian 200 ducats for dedicating to him a translation of Herodotus, but for the rest he hardly bothered his head about the humanists. He continued leisurely and quite by proxy the repair and adornment of Rome. He engaged Antonio Pagliuolo to build the Villa Belvedere in the Vatican gardens, and Andrea Mantegna to paint frescoes in a chapel adjoining it. But for the most part he left the patronage of letters and art to magnates and cardinals. In a similar mood of genial laissez-faire, he entrusted foreign policy first to Cardinal della Rovere, then to Lorenzo de' Medici. The powerful banker offered his richly dowered daughter, Maddalena, as a bride for the Pope's son, Francischetto Cibo. Innocent was agreeable and signed an alliance with Florence in 1487. Thereafter he allowed the experienced and pacific Florentine to guide the papal policy. For 5 years Italy enjoyed peace. The age of Innocent was amused by one of the strangest comedies in history. After the death of Mohammed II in 1481, his sons Bajazet II and Jem fought a civil war for the Ottoman throne. Defeated at Brusa, Jem sought to escape death by surrendering to the Knights of St. John in Rhodes in 1482. Their Grand Master, Pierre d'Aubusson, held him as a threat over Bajazet. The Sultan agreed to pay the knights 45,000 ducats yearly, ostensibly for Jem's maintenance, actually as an inducement not to set up Jem as a pretender to the Turkish Sultanate and a useful ally in a Christian crusade. To better safeguard so lucrative a prisoner, d'Aubusson sent him to knightly custody in France. The Sultan of Egypt, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, Ferrante of Naples, and Innocent himself all offered large sums to d'Aubusson to transfer Jem to their care. The Pope won because, in addition to ducats, he promised the Grand Master a red hat and helped Charles VIII of France to secure the hand and province of Anne of Brittany. So, on March the 13th, 1484, the Grand Turk, as Jem was now called, was escorted in princely cavalcade through the streets of Rome to the Vatican and received courteous and luxurious imprisonment. Bajazet, to ensure the honorable intentions of the Pope, sent him 3 years' salary for the upkeep of Jem. And in 1492 he dispatched to Innocent what he assured him was the head of the lancet that had pierced the side of Christ. Some cardinals were skeptical, but the Pope arranged that the relic should be brought from Ancona to Rome. When it reached the Porta del Popolo, he himself received it and bore it in solemn ceremony to the Vatican. Cardinal Borgia held it aloft for the people's reverence, and then returned to his mistress. Despite the Sultan's contribution to the support of the Church, Innocent found it troublesome to make ends meet. Like Sixtus IV and most of the rulers of Europe, he replenished his coffers by charging fees for appointment to office, and finding this lucrative, he created new offices to sell. By raising the number of papal secretaries to 26, he realized 62,400 ducats. He increased to 52 the probatores, whose heavy task was to place a leaden seal on papal decrees, and received 2,500 ducats from each appointee. Such practices might have been no worse than selling annuity insurance, had it not been that the incumbents reimbursed themselves not merely by their salaries, but by candid venality in their functions. For example, 2 papal secretaries confessed that in 2 years they had forged more than 50 papal bulls granting dispensations. The angry pope had the men hanged and burned for stealing beyond their station. This in 1489. Everything in Rome seemed purchasable, from judicial pardons to the papacy itself. The unreliable Infessura tells of a man who committed incest with his 2 daughters, then murdered them, and was let off by paying 800 ducats. When Cardinal Borgia was asked why justice was not done, he is reputed to have answered, "God desires not the death of a sinner, but rather that he should pay and live." The Pope's son, Franceschetto Cibo, was an unprincipled scoundrel. He forced his way into private homes for evil purposes. He saw to it that of the fines levied in the ecclesiastical courts of Rome, a substantial portion should go to himself, and he spent his spoils in gambling. One night he lost 14,000 ducats, or $350,000, to Cardinal Raffaele Riario. He complained to the Pope that he had been cheated, and Innocent tried to recover the sum for him, but the Cardinal professed to have already used up the sum on the immense Palazzo della Cancelleria that he was building. The secularization of the papacy, its absorption in politics, war, and finance, had filled the College of Cardinals with appointees noted for their administrative ability, their political influence, or their capacity to pay for their hats. Despite his promise to keep the college down to 24 members, Innocent added to it 8 men, most of whom were eminently unsuited to such a dignity. So the cardinalate was conferred upon the 13-year-old Giovanni de' Medici as part of a bargain with Lorenzo. Many of the cardinals were men of high education, benevolent patrons of literature, music, drama, and art. A few of them were saintly. Several had taken only minor orders and were not yet priests. Many of them were frankly secular. Their political, diplomatic, and fiscal duties required them to be men of the world, capable of meeting on a level of knowledge and subtlety the similar officials of Italian or transalpine governments. Some of them imitated the Roman nobles, fortified their palaces, and retained armed men to protect themselves from these nobles, and the Roman mob, and other cardinals. Perhaps the great Catholic historian Pastor is a bit too severe on them, in view of their secular functions. Lorenzo de' Medici's low estimate of the College of Cardinals in the time of Innocent VIII was unfortunately only too well-founded. Of the worldly cardinals, Ascanio Sforza, Riario, Orsini, Sclafenatus, Jean de la Balue, Giuliano della Rovere, Savelli, and Rodrigo Borgia were the most prominent. All of these were deeply infected with the corruption that prevailed in Italy amongst the upper classes in the age of the Renaissance. Surrounded in their splendid palaces, with all the most refined luxury of a highly developed civilization, these cardinals lived the lives of secular princes, and seemed to regard their ecclesiastical garb simply as one of the adornments of their rank. They hunted, gambled, gave sumptuous banquets and entertainments, joined in all the rollicking merriment of the carnival tide, and allowed themselves the utmost license in morals. This was especially the case with Rodrigo Borgia. The disorder at the top reflected and enhanced the moral chaos of Rome. Violence, thievery, rape, bribery, conspiracy, revenge were the order of the day. Each dawn revealed in the alleys men who had been killed during the night. Pilgrims and ambassadors were waylaid, were sometimes stripped naked as they approached the capital of Christendom. Women were attacked in the streets or in their homes. A piece of the true cross, encased in silver, was stolen from the sacristy of Santa Maria in Trastevere. Later the wood, shorn of its setting, was found in a vineyard. Such religious skepticism was widespread. Over 500 Roman families were condemned for heresy, but were let off with fines. Perhaps the mercenary curia of Rome was preferable to the mercenary and murderous inquisitors who were now ravaging Spain. Even priests had their doubts. One was accused of substituting, for the words of transubstantiation in the Mass, his own formula, "O fatuous Christians who adore food and drink as God." As the end of Innocent's pontificate approached, prophets appeared who proclaimed impending doom, and in Florence the voice of Savonarola was rising to brand the age as that of Antichrist. On September 20th, 1492, says a chronicler, there was a great tumult in the city of Rome, and the merchants closed their shops. People who were in the fields and vineyards returned home in haste because it was announced that Pope Innocent VIII was dead. Strange stories were told of his dying hours, how the cardinals placed Gem under special guards lest Franceschetto Cibo should appropriate him, how Cardinals Borgia and della Rovere had almost come to blows beside the deathbed, and the dubious Infessura is our oldest authority for the report that 3 boys died from giving too much of their blood in a transfusion designed to revive the failing pope. Innocent bequeathed 48,000 ducats, or about $600,000, to his relatives, and passed away. He was buried in St. Peter's, and Antonio Palaiuolo covered his sins with a splendid tomb. Chapter 16. The Borgias, 1492 to 1503. 1. Cardinal Borgia. The most interesting of the Renaissance popes was born at Játiva, Spain, on January 1st, 1431. His parents were cousins, both of the Borjas, a family of some slight nobility. Rodrigo received his education at Játiva, Valencia, and Bologna. When his uncle became a cardinal, and then Pope Calixtus III, a strange path was opened for the young man's advancement in an ecclesiastical career. Moving to Italy, he respelled his name Borgia, was made a cardinal at 25, and at 26 received the fruitful office of vice-chancellor, head of the entire curia. He performed his duties competently, earned some repute as an administrator, lived abstemiously, and made many friends in either sex. He was not yet, would not be till his 37th year, a priest. He was so handsome in his youth, so attractive in the grace of his manners, his sensual ardor and cheerful temperament, his persuasive eloquence and gay wit, that women found it hard to resist him. Brought up in the easygoing morality of 15th century Italy, and perceiving that many a cleric, many a priest, allowed himself the pleasure of women, this young Lothario in the purple decided to enjoy all the gifts that God had given him and them. Pius II reproved him for attending an immodest and seductive dance in 1460, but the Pope accepted Rodrigo's apology and continued him as vice-chancellor and trusted aide. In that year, Rodrigo's first son, Pedro Luis, was born, or begotten, and perhaps also his daughter, Girolama, who was married in 1482. Their mothers are not known. Pedro lived in Spain till 1488, came to Rome in that year, and died soon afterward. In 1464, Rodrigo accompanied Pius II to Ancona, and there contracted some minor sexual disease, because, said his doctor, he had not slept alone. About 1466, he formed a more permanent attachment with Vannozza de Catanei, some 24 years old. Unfortunately, she was married to Domenico d'Arignano, but Domenico left her in 1476. To Rodrigo, who had become a priest in 1468, Vannozza bore 4 children. In 1474, Giovanni. In 1476, Cesare, whom we shall call Caesar. In 1480, Lucrezia. In 1481, Joffre. These 4 were ascribed to Vannozza on her tombstone, and were at one time or another acknowledged by Rodrigo as his own. Such persistent parentage suggests an almost monogamous union, and perhaps Cardinal Borgia, in comparison with other ecclesiastics, may be credited with a certain domestic fidelity and stability. He was a tender and benevolent father. It was a pity that his efforts to advance his children did not always bring glory to the Church. When Rodrigo set his eye on the papacy, he found a tolerant husband for Vannozza and helped her to prosperity. She was twice widowed, married again, lived in modest retirement, rejoiced in the rise of her children to fame and wealth, mourned her separation from them, earned a reputation for piety, died at 76 in 1518, and left all her substantial property to the Church. Leo X sent his chamberlain to attend her ceremonious funeral. We should betray a lack of historical sense were we to judge Alexander VI from the moral standpoint of our age, or rather of our youth. His contemporaries looked upon his pre-papal sexual sins as only canonically mortal, but in the moral climate of his time, venial and forgivable. Even in the generation between the reproof given him by Pius II and Rodrigo's elevation to the papacy, public opinion had become more lenient toward unobtrusive sexual digressions from clerical celibacy. Pius II himself, besides spawning some love children in his pre-sacerdotal youth, had once advocated the marriage of priests, Sixtus IV had had several children. Innocent VIII had brought his into the Vatican. Some condemned the morals of Rodrigo, but apparently no one mentioned them when the conclave met to choose a successor to Innocent. 5 popes, including the reasonably virtuous Nicholas V, had granted him lucrative benefices through all these years, had entrusted him with difficult missions and responsible posts, and had apparently, Pius II for a moment excepted, taken no notice of his philoprogenitive exuberance. What men remarked in 1492 was that he had been vice-chancellor for 35 years, had been appointed and reappointed to that office by 5 successive popes, and had administered the office with conspicuous industry and competence, and that the external magnificence of his palace concealed a remarkable simplicity of private life. Jacopo di Volterra, in 1486, described him as a man of an intellect capable of anything, and of great sense. He is a ready speaker, is of an astute nature, and has wonderful skill in conducting affairs. He was popular with the Romans, having amused them with games. When news reached Rome that Granada had fallen to the Christians, he regaled Rome with a bullfight in Spanish style. Perhaps the cardinals assembling in conclave on August 6, 1492, were also interested in his wealth, for in 5 administrations he had become the richest cardinal, excepting de Tutteville, in the memory of Rome. They relied upon him to make substantial presents to those who should vote for him, and he did not fail them. To Cardinal Sforza he promised the vice-chancellorship, several rich benefices, and the Borgia Palace in Rome. To Cardinal Orsini the sea and ecclesiastical revenues of Cartagena, the towns of Monticello and Soriano, and the governorship of the Marches. To Cardinal Savelli, Civita Castellana, and the bishopric of Majorca, and so on. Infessora described the process as Borgia's evangelical distribution of his goods to the poor. It was not an unusual procedure. Every candidate had used it for many conclaves past, as every candidate uses it in politics today. Whether money bribes were also used is uncertain. The decisive vote was cast by Cardinal Gherardo, 96 years old, and hardly in possession of his faculties. Finally, all the cardinals rushed to the winning side and made the election of Rodrigo Borgia unanimous on August 10, 1492. When asked by what name he wished to be called as pope, he answered, "By the name of the invincible Alexander." It was a pagan beginning for a pagan pontificate. 2. Alexander VI. The choice of the conclave was also the choice of the people. Never had any papal election brought so much rejoicing. Never had a coronation been so magnificent. The populace delighted in the panoramic cavalcade of white horses, allegorical figures, tapestries and paintings, knights and grandees, troops of archers and Turkish horsemen, 700 priests, cardinals colorfully clad, and finally Alexander himself, 61 years old but majestically straight and tall, overflowing with health and energy and pride, serene of countenance and of surpassing dignity, said an eyewitness, and looking like an emperor even while blessing the multitude. Only a few sober minds, like Giuliano della Rovere and Giovanni de' Medici, expressed some apprehension lest the new pope, known to be a fond father, would use his power to aggrandize his family rather than to cleanse and strengthen the Church. He began well. In the 36 days between the death of Innocent and the coronation of Alexander, there had been 220 known murders in Rome. The new pope made an example of the first captured assassin. The culprit was hanged, his brother was hanged with him, and his house was pulled down. The city approved this severity. Crime hid its head, order was restored in Rome, and all Italy was glad that a strong hand was at the helm of the Church. Art and literature marked time. Alexander did considerable building in and out of Rome, financed a new ceiling for Santa Maria Maggiore with a gift of American gold from Ferdinand and Isabella, remodeled the mausoleum of Hadrian into the fortified castle of Sant'Angelo, and redecorated its interior to provide cells for papal prisoners and more comfortable quarters for harassed popes. He built between the castle and the Vatican a long covered corridor which gave him refuge from Charles VIII in 1494 and saved Clement VII from a Lutheran noose in the sack of Rome. Pinturicchio was engaged to adorn the Appartamento Borgia in the Vatican. 4 of these 6 rooms were restored and opened to the public by Leo XIII. A lunette in one of them contains a vivid portrait of Alexander, a happy face, a prosperous body, gorgeous robes. In another room, a virgin teaching the child to read was described by Vasari as a portrait of Giulia Farnese, an alleged mistress of the Pope. Vasari adds that the picture also contained the head of Pope Alexander adoring her, but no picture of him is there visible. He rebuilt the University of Rome, called to it several distinguished teachers, and paid them with unheard-of regularity. He liked drama and was pleased to have the students of the Roman Academy stage comedies and ballets for his family festivals. He preferred light music to heavy philosophy. In 1501 he re-established censorship of publications by an edict requiring that no book might be printed without the approval of the local archbishop. But he allowed a wide freedom of satire and debate. He laughed off the bites of the town wits and rejected Caesar Borgia's proposal that such snipers should be disciplined. "Rome is a free city," he told the Ferrarese ambassador, "where everyone can say or write whatever he pleases. They say much evil of me, but I don't mind." His administration of church affairs was, in the early years of his pontificate, unusually efficient. Innocent VIII had left a debt in the treasury. It needed all the financial ability of Alexander to restore the papal finances. It took him 2 years to balance the budget. The Vatican staff was reduced, and expenses were curtailed, but records were strictly kept and salaries were promptly paid. Alexander performed the laborious religious ritual of his office with fidelity, but with the impatience of a busy man. His Magister Ceremoniarum was a German, Johann Burckhardt, who helped to perpetuate the fame and infamy of his employer by recording in a diarium nearly all that he saw, including much that Alexander would have wished unseen. To the cardinals the Pope gave as he had promised in the conclave, and he was even more generous to those who, like Cardinal de' Medici, had longest opposed him. A year after his accession he created 12 new cardinals. Several were men of real ability. Some were appointed at the request of political powers that it was wise to conciliate. 2 were scandalously young, Ippolito d'Este, 15, and Caesar Borgia, 18. One of them, Alessandro Farnese, owed his elevation to his sister Giulia Farnese, who was believed by many to be a mistress of the Pope. The sharp-tongued Romans, not foreseeing that they would one day acclaim Alessandro as Paul III, called him Il Cardinale della Gonella, the Cardinal of the Petticoat. The strongest of the older cardinals, Giuliano della Rovere, was displeased to find that he, who had often ruled Innocent VIII, had little influence with Alexander, who had made Cardinal Sforza his favorite counselor. In a huff, Giuliano retired to his episcopal see at Ostia and formed a guard of armed men. A year later he fled to France and besought Charles VIII to invade Italy, summon a general council, and depose Alexander as a shamelessly simoniacal pope. Meanwhile, Alexander was facing the political problems of a papacy caught between the millstones of scheming Italian powers. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.